everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Zane, I'm talking about the 2009 breakout album from Owl City, Ocean Eyes. Alright, out of all the projects on this round of my Patreon schedule, this was definitely the request I was most dreading. The moment this album, the big mainstream breakout of synth pop and indie pop artist Adam Young, aka Owl City, got sent in to me, I immediately hesitated. I was like, well, technically I don't have a good enough reason to turn this down. I know exactly why someone would hear a project like this and think the electronic music guy might be the right person to talk about it. But this was definitely pushing the boundaries of my format a bit, and it's not the kind of thing I ever would have willingly chosen to cover. But the guy who requested this was really dead set on me doing this video even in the face of my hesitation, so I was like, alright, fine, it counts just barely enough to let this slide. The requester was also confused as to why something like this would be pushing the boundaries of my format in the first place. After all, it is primarily a synth-driven project produced entirely by one guy. Sure, it's poppy and got some mild indie rock influences, if you want to call it that, but it's still clearly electronic first and foremost, and I've had no problems covering acts that fall under a similar blurry genre line in the past, like M83 or LCD Sound System, so what might be the issue here? So I'll reiterate what I said to him. My format is not really about what has the most synths or electronics. It's about music made with a certain kind of mindset and appealing to certain subsets of culture. Not all music that prominently features synths on it feels like the kind of electronic music I have a background in covering, and not all music that does feel like it could easily fit in my format even prominently features synths. There may be a lot of overlap between electronic and pop music, but those are still two different genres that require different standpoints and rubrics by which to write about. It's almost like they're different languages, and one of them I'm a lot more fluent in than the other. There will come a point somewhere along that blurry line where I don't feel like my perspective will really be useful. It's the same deal with electronic and hip-hop. Lots of shared history, lots of overlap between the genres, but also loads of stuff in the latter genre that I do not feel like I have any business trying to talk about in a video. It's true that Owl City is in fact a synth-pop artist who self-produced his work, at the time at least. Not to mention, the guy has done multiple collabs with commercial trance artists, including Chicane, Armin van Buuren, and Paul van Dyk. So it's not like he's a complete outsider to the culture of electronic music or anything. Again, I didn't feel like I had a good enough excuse to reject this request outright, especially considering I have covered synth-pop artists before. But I've always tended to feel like Owl City comes about his music specifically from more of a pop mindset and not really an electronic mindset, in a particular way that makes me feel a bit more out of my element trying to talk about him. It's the same reason I tend not to cover other more electronic-leaning contemporary mainstream pop records. See The Weeknd's Dawn FM, or more recently, Charlie XCX's Brat. Sure, they're technically electronic enough for me to cover, but I feel like that stuff is better covered by people who listen to more regular pop music than I do. And they already are widely covered by those people. I don't really have anything to add to those conversations that other people aren't doing better. I suppose one angle that can allow me to have more of an inroad to talking about pop acts like this is if they have a really obvious overarching influence on the world of electronic music. Like, I wouldn't feel uncomfortable talking about bands like Depeche Mode or New Order, for instance, just for how obvious their influence is on the genre I love the most, despite those arguably being more traditional pop or rock outfits at their core. Their mindsets and styles directly contributed to forming the mindsets and styles of more traditionally electronic outfits, which are more in my element. And while Owl City's influence on electronic music is obviously nowhere even in the same ballpark of importance as Depeche Mode, the guy did at least have some clear influence in shaping the direction of this genre at the time. I feel like back when this guy first broke out in 2009, the idea of a self-produced pop artist like him was still something of a novelty. He obviously may not have invented the genre of bedroom pop, and I'll get to that one big elephant in the room influence that everyone always brings up when they talk about this guy's work later in this video. But an artist making everything by himself in a DAW and gaining traction through the internet, back then through MySpace, before going on to be signed to a major label and directly cross over into the mainstream with the same material that first blew him up, that was kind of groundbreaking for the time. He was one of the first contributors to that trend, which would pick up more through the 2010s of indie acts getting fluke mainstream crossovers, as well as the trend of millennial indie music getting progressively more and more commercial as the Imagine Dragons and One Republics of the world started to gain more traction. Or M83 seeing their most mainstream success and influence, if you want a more positive example. And it's also easy to see how his work would resonate with the burgeoning EDM crowd of the time. His style slotted pretty well into that scene, who themselves were seeing more and more artists starting with self-production and blowing up to more mainstream levels. There's a direct line of causation between the success of Owl City and the eventual success of EDM artists like Porter Robinson and Madeon, who, even if they may not have directly credited him as an influence, probably wouldn't have gotten as big as they did if Owl City hadn't primed the pump for them and created more of a demand for that type of music, combining electronic and indie styles with hyper-earnest writing. So yeah, in all those ways, Owl City is definitely an influential figure in the electronic music world, and it does make sense to look at his work and think it would make the most sense for someone like me to be talking about it. I can definitely respect what he's done. The fact that Fireflies is just one of those songs that every single late millennial and Gen Z person will remember and will have heard at least once in their lifetime. Even if there were other hits that were far bigger and more ubiquitous at the time, the fact that it's just stuck around in everyone's minds for such a long time after its heights, I think is a testament to something. Now, all of this is completely ignoring my own personal thoughts on Owl City, which, I'll be honest, I don't really have much of a history or long-running personal connection with his work. I obviously knew Fireflies and his other big hit Good Time with Carly Rae Jepsen, as well as the above-mentioned guest appearances he made on commercial trance projects, but they were all just kind of songs that were there and I didn't really have any strong feelings on. The strongest association I had in my mind with his work was a YTP one of my old colleagues made of his biggest hit in 2017. I'd like to make noise! And making this video marked the first time I'd ever listened to an Owl City album in its full entirety. He was always an artist I understood to be really influential, but I was never interested enough to actually go out and check out myself. And man, listening to Owl City's Ocean Eyes in full for the first time in February 2025 without having any previous nostalgic attachment is, really not an experience I would recommend. I felt like I was goddamn dissociating. Not like any of the other previous brushes I'd had with his music didn't make it blatantly obvious what I was getting into, but this is some of the most insanely twee electropop music I've heard in my entire life, made by someone who delivers every line like he's never experienced any real suffering in his life. It sounds like what a 12-year-old raised on the Disney Channel would imagine is deep, or what you think of when you hear the word millennial being used as a pejorative. And hearing this while sitting in the middle of a world going through massive political upheaval, the federal US government being all but purchased and dismantled by tech billionaires at the expense of everyone else in the world, trans and queer people and immigrants in the process of having their rights to exist rapidly getting stripped away, and every other imaginable minority group under some kind of direct threat, climate crisis, war and death and despair everywhere you look. Listening to an album like this right now made me feel like I was losing my goddamn mind, and the sheer mindless happiness on display made me want to break things. Not like I can really get mad at Owl City for that. Pop culture in 2009 may as well exist in a completely different universe from the one we live in now. We were recovering from a huge economic recession, but weren't seeing the level of unignorable class division and social strife we'd be seeing a decade later. Or rather, it wasn't in, like, mainstream view. We still thought electing a black president was gonna solve everything. And nearly every big hit of the time was some kind of party music or escapism. Lady Gaga and the Black Eyed Peas were the biggest pop stars in the world. Everyone wanted to feel like having a good time without thinking about the crappiness of the real world. Really, if there was any time to get into Owl City, it was gonna be that turn-of-the-decade era when he first broke out. As ahead of his time as he might have been in some ways, he was just as much a product of his time in all other ways. As I gave this album a couple more listens and the initial culture shock wore off, I did find it less aggressively unpalatable. Even on first listen, I did keep in mind that this brand of twee millennial indie pop is capable of being a heck of a lot more obnoxious than this. I am aware of the existence of AJR, but I still think the general feeling I have coming off of Ocean Eyes is just... it's not my thing. I don't really like the breathy, boyish tone of his vocals or his delivery, which seems to be capable of delivering the one emotion of, gosh golly darn, the world is a cool, big place, isn't it? Without any other deeper nuance. It's fine for like a song or two, but over the course of a full album, oh my gosh, it's really wear out on me. I have a hard time getting into the ridiculously upbeat mood of the instrumentals or how plastic they can feel. The production is on that border of mainstream and underground that doesn't really have the appeal of either side of that equation. It feels very commercial and radio friendly, but not really in an impressive way. Unpolished and basic enough where it's easy to imagine one guy made it all in a DAW in his parents' basement, but not unpolished enough to really have that DIY producer charm. There's not really a lot of sonic variety from track to track. All of it sounds kinda like Fireflies with the energy level cranked up or down. And the writing... I mean, it's definitely the kind of writing you'd expect from the guy who wrote the line, I get 1,000 hugs from 10,000 lightning bugs. It's very twee and naive, a lot of corny on the nose metaphors from nature or other places which can be both generic feeling and cliche, but also oddly specific at the same time. There's nothing about this stuff that I feel like I can get mad at. It is abundantly clear that he wholeheartedly believes in everything he's saying, and there is not a single hint of irony or self-awareness. I can easily respect the sheer level of sincerity and how completely unafraid he is to look uncool. And the pop melodies are all pretty well constructed for what they are. But everything is sitting on that extremely thin line between being uplifting and mood-brightening and profoundly annoying. And in terms of personal enjoyments, the track listing could not be more of a wildly all-over-the-place mixed bag. It's probably not much of a surprise to hear that my favorite track is just the big hit, for the simple reason it's the only one to benefit from any kind of nostalgia. It's a tune that everyone of a certain age will easily be able to remember, and the lyrical sentiment of wanting time to slow down and for planet Earth to turn more slowly, nostalgic memories and wonder of nature, does come together pretty effectively with just enough of an undercurrent of melancholy and subtle reminders of how fleeting these happy feelings can be to not feel corny. I also warmed up to the album's opener, Cave In, and its yearning for escape from the humdrumness of his suburban Minnesota life. The Saltwater Room has some really nice guest vocal performances from Brianne Duran, and they have some solid vocal chemistry on the chorus there. It's one of the better tunes. And while I could easily see Umbrella Beach being really obnoxious for other people, the instrumental reminds me a lot of EDM and trance cuts from that era in a way that hits those old nostalgia buttons and fundamentally understands that going for broke appeal that those big emotional EDM and 2000s trance anthems which inspired it. Very easy to see the through line between a track like this and him going on to work with Armin van Buuren on that guy's best album, which isn't saying much, but you know. And I suppose On the Wing is fine enough too. It doesn't really have that strong a hook, but I do kind of like how expansive it sounds and the way the string sections are worked into the instrumental. Both that track and The Saltwater Room are apparently repurposed from his self-released debut album Maybe I'm Dreaming from the year prior, which I haven't bothered to listen to. But for as many moments like these on this album which are able to hit well enough for me, there's just as many, if not more, moments that fall flat for me, or in a couple of cases just completely drive me up the wall. In terms of the album's most annoying moments, The Bird and the Worm has all these jangly-ass acoustic guitars and chimes that sound like a goddamn McDonald's commercial, and the whole early bird getting the worm metaphor makes me want to punch somebody. Also, when he had the line, with friends like these, who needs enemies, I was like, man, that is dangerously on the verge of just being a Finding Nemo reference, until he actually made the Finding Nemo reference later in the track, and I was like, god fucking damn it. But somehow that's nothing compared to the track Dental Care, which doesn't just have an equally punchable, jangly commercial soundtrack instrumental, but it's also a track all about how much fun it is to go to the dentist. Literally, it's just about going to the dentist and coming out with a great smile that you can flash to everybody. I suppose technically less irritating a sentiment on paper than, say, Porter Robinson writing about how he regrets getting veneers because he liked it better when his teeth looked worse. But oh my god, is this track delivered with an absolutely psychotic level of positivity, complete with making a bunch of dentist-related dad jokes? He's been to the dentist so many times, so he knows the drill. When hygienists leave for long vacations, that's when dentists scream and lose their patience. Golf and alcohol don't mix, so that's why he doesn't drink and drive. Get it? Like a driver, like the club. Get it? That doesn't even have anything to do with the topic of the song. He just goes on a digression to make a golf punt for no reason. What the fuck? I genuinely do not understand what would bring a person to unironically write a song like this. Not like ironically writing a song like this would be any better, but still. It absolutely makes my skin crawl from beginning to end. The rest of the track listing doesn't make my skin crawl like those two tracks do, but I'd be lying if I said I especially cared for any of the remaining tracks. Vanilla Twilight is a really bland and flavorless breakup ballad with a really uninteresting 4 chords of pop chord progression and the most lifeless plastic synth pop instrumental. I suppose only fitting for one of the album's most vanilla sounding tracks to literally have vanilla in its title. The Tip of the Iceberg is a track that's trying to be about winter and keeping you warm, but also sounds just as summery as everything else on the album. Also, according to the artist himself, it's allegedly about the realization of wasting your life and not wanting to take things for granted, which would be cool, although I do not hear any lyrics which seem to actually have anything to do with that sentiment, metaphorically or otherwise. Maybe the one line about inertia being a con, but even that feels like a bit of a reach. Hello Seattle is the first song Owl City ever wrote, originally appearing on his debut EP Of June from 2 years prior, and it shows him writing from the perspective of a mountaineer and a manta ray and the moon and a seahorse and other stuff, and he has like 2 lines to dedicate to each one as they say hello to the city. Listening to it feels like reading a children's picture book like Goodnight Moon or something. Maybe that would be nice if I had kids, but there is no way I'm gonna be interested to hear that on my own time. And then there's the tracks Meteor Shower and Tidal Wave, which are definitely the tracks I most wanted to like, but soured on me once I read more into what they were trying to do. At first I heard the slower ballad instrumental of Meteor Shower and thought it made for a nice sonic change of pace from the rest of the album, and I saw Tidal Wave as an admirable enough attempt to write about his experience with depression of all things. He doesn't write about it like any depression I've experienced, the parts about it feeling unending, feeling true to life, but he talks about like having dramatic downfalls and tidal waves of sorrow, which doesn't feel quite right to me. Depression in my experience is a lot more about like long stretches of unfeeling and tiredness, and there's absolutely nothing dramatic about it. I wonder if there's any other music out there of a similar stripe which echoes my experience with these kinds of feelings a lot more closely. But I was like, whatever, I suppose not all depression is created equal. If that's how he experienced it, then sure, I'm not about to invalidate that. What soured me on this track and Meteor Shower is when I looked more closely into the lyrics and found out the real point of both tracks was not to be like semi-desperate, semi-inspirational ballads, but instead expressions of his love for Jesus and how finding Christianity allowed him to feel new and born again. Meteor Shower is about how he feels incomplete without God, and Tidal Wave is about how God gave him a light in the dark and allowed him to overcome his depression. I mean, at least he's never smug or in your face about it, and he never mentions God or Jesus by name. There's like half a line in each song which are subtle biblical references, like having been made new or being blind, but then I see. It's all generically worded enough where you can miss out on that aspect altogether, and it's clear he's not trying to like shove Christian values down your throat. He's just speaking on how they've helped him personally. So I'm not gonna like belabor the point, but still, once you see that reading, pun intended, it's hard to unsee those tracks being about, man, I picked the right religion and Jesus makes me feel whole, like him making synth-pop contemporary Christian music, and yeah, no thank you. As someone who's had a bit of a fraught relationship with organized religion, I just could not get on board for that shit. But yeah, that's everything on Ocean Eyes. This album's kinda hard to get through, I'm not gonna lie. There's tracks I like on here, sure, and the big hit is kind of a classic for my generation, whether you like it or not. It's just a good pop song that everyone remembers, which obviously helped open the door for more indie acts to get mainstream breakthroughs, and obviously also a direct inspiration on many a bedroom pop producer in years to come. But man, the album still tries to reach a level of happy that makes it difficult for me to relate to, even on the supposed sadder moments. And while again I can't get mad at that, as he approaches that with such obvious sincerity and it was just true to how he personally felt, none of this is pretending to be anything other than what it is, and I can believe all of this felt real for him at the time, but it still feels almost alien to listen to an album that feels so safe and secure and celebrating joy and happiness while seemingly completely unaware of all the troubles in the world. Especially jarring to hear something like this for the first time in this day and age. If only there were an album that had all the same musical ingredients as this, but could make its emotional core feel a lot more real and relatable, that had a lot more nuance behind its compositions and performances, that was a critical darling for years before Owl City even came onto the scene. Okay, I think I've danced around the topic enough, but no review of Owl City's Ocean Eyes would be complete if it didn't mention...
Say the line, Bart!
The Postal Service.
Yeah!
The one-off 2003 side project of Death Cab for Cutie frontman Ben Gibbard working with producer Jimmy Tamborello, aka Dintel. Every single review of Owl City that has ever existed is all but obligated to mention this act, since the influence is so on-the-nose obvious to be practically unignorable. In fact, every single one of this album's most negative reviews goes as far as to say that Ocean Eyes is no more than a shallow ripoff of the Postal Service, which steals the exact same ideas they had first and cynically waters them down to be repackaged to a normie mainstream audience. And it's not difficult to hear where that sentiment comes from. The sound is ridiculously similar, all the musical ingredients are the same, similar fluttery texture of synth melodies and thicker synthetic beat work adding up to that kind of bedroom pop aesthetic. The synth arpeggios on a track like Such Great Heights sound very similar to the ones that would show up on Fireflies. There's a similar breathy and mid-higher pitched vocal style. Adam Young and Ben Gibbard just have voices that kind of sound like each other. There's even lyrical parallels, not just with themes of escapism from real life, but sometimes it even gets more specific, like the hook of the Postal Service track Clark Gable starts with the line, "I want so badly to believe that there is truth that love is real," even scans with the same rhythm as I'd like to make myself believe. And Owl City, a guy from Minnesota, made his first song called Hello Seattle, and the Postal Service are actually from Seattle. Okay, maybe that last parallel is a bit of a stretch, but still, it's very easy to see why literally everyone who tried to review Owl City both positively and negatively back in its heyday drew these exact parallels. Now, to be clear, I didn't really have a horse in this race. This video also marked the first time I had heard the Postal Service album in full. It was an album I'd known about for a long time, but just like Owl City, I never felt compelled to look into, as I suspected it wouldn't really be my thing. Turns out I very much suspected wrong in that case, since with just one listen of that album, I immediately understood exactly where the hype came from. It's a phenomenal pop album, which I connected to a lot more viscerally, especially given the ongoing state of the world, being disarmed by the mildly pretty and lo-fi synth-pop instrumentals, only to be hit hard by all the lyrical sentiments of just feeling so tired and beat down by the bullshit of the world and yearning for an escape from all of it, with just barely enough lyrical detail to make it feel a heck of a lot more real. I'm not about to disagree with the consensus everyone's already built on that album. It's excellent, and Owl City does not come close to hitting the same level of quality for me. Now, would I say Owl City's a shallow ripoff of the Postal Service? Not really. I think that's a reductive way to look at it. There may be a lot of similarities between the two, but there's also some massive differences as well, especially when it comes to the emotions they're trying to express in their underlying attitude. Ben Gibbard may have a very similar vocal tone to Adam Young, but Gibbard definitely sounds more like an actual adult. He sounds much more world-weary and like he's had more actual life experience, even if there is still a hint of that youthfulness left in there of not knowing what the fuck you're doing with your life. Guy was clearly in his late 20s and on the border of crossing over into his 30s, not unlike myself. Compared to Adam Young, who despite being, I think, 23 when he made Ocean Eyes, sounds like a teenager. Also, Dintel's production is a lot more actually lo-fi feeling compared to Owl City's more radio-friendly approach. I think there's a lot of parallels between the Postal Service and the sound of something like Radiohead's Kid A. Very similar mood, similar, very mild experimental edge, even if less experimental in the Postal Service's case, and just an all-around kind of dejected Gen X sort of attitude. Both albums kind of hit me on a similar level, and I'm gonna be honest, the Postal Service might have actually been easier for me to get into than Kid A, since they don't have the weight of introducing IDM sound design to a more mainstream rock crowd who'd never heard of that stuff before and getting ridiculously overpraised for doing so, but I'm getting off topic. The difference in approach between Owl City and the Postal Service is obvious just when you look at the titles and covers of their albums. Owl City's album is called Ocean Eyes. It's trying to evoke childlike wonder with this bright blue color palette and the picture of that one fancy hotel in Dubai. The Postal Service's album is called Give Up. It's completely gray and has a picture of a windowsill and the end of someone's bed. I don't think much else needs to be said there. These two acts were not aiming to create the same experience. I've even seen an interview where Owl City was asked about the influence of the Postal Service on his work, and he claims the parallels were completely accidental. He does admit to obviously having heard the Postal Service before he started it. He also said he could see exactly why so many people thought they were similar, and that he'd become a much bigger fan of theirs in retrospect, but he says that influence was not a conscious thing for him. It just kind of turned out that way. I suppose whether or not you believe that is up to you, but that does sound about right to me. It's not like someone can own the copyright on bubbly synth arpeggios and breathy indie voice. At the end of the day, I don't think any of the parallels between Owl City and the Postal Service actively work against Owl City's appeal to me. All the things they have in common are the things I still appreciate about Owl City, and all their biggest and most stark differences are the things I dislike the most about Owl City. And I do think Fireflies still has more of a universal sort of appeal, which the Postal Service doesn't to the same extent. The Postal Service may be hugely hyped up indie darlings and Give Up may be certified platinum in sales, which is nothing to sniff at. I'm willing to believe I'm perceiving this wrong based on my age and the era I grew up in, but Give Up still feels like an album that's huge specifically with the music lover crowd. Meanwhile, Fireflies is again a track that feels like everyone knows regardless of whether they're music fans or not. I feel like it reached a level of cultural penetration the Postal Service didn't to quite the same extent. The trouble I have with this album is that, once again, it's just kind of difficult for me to relate to, and I don't really find the joy in his brand of escapism fantasy that he's trying to provide. I find it to be a little too sugary and mindless, and his particular brand of twee sincerity, really obviously informed by his privileged background, to be kind of annoying, even if I would understand the appeal for other people. If you love Owl City's Ocean Eyes, I think that's great. I get it. If you hate Owl City's Ocean Eyes, I would get that too. But as for myself, I just think it's okay. This album, featuring both one of the most influential and ahead of its time hit songs of the late 2000s, as well as that frigging dentist song, are strengths and weaknesses that probably about equally cancel each other out. I don't think there's anything about Ocean Eyes worth getting angry at or offended by. I can't hate on what he did here. It's just not my personal cup of tea, and I have no desire to ever listen to this again. And I'm overall feeling a solid 5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
Time to go.